Welcome to episode 4 of Untold Wealth, your homely and favorite economics podcast with myself, Devon Murphy, and my co-host,
Vince Bullock.
All right, and welcome. This is essentially your podcast for all things economics in a more dumbed-down terms. If you don't know, Vincent and I studied at the University of Cape Town. We both studied economics together. You know, we were pretty good at it, had the same classes, but, you know, our paths have diverged from economics in late years. But we both understood we have a passion for it still. So when Vince and I have been swimming recently, we decided to start a podcast. And what better to start a podcast with than economics, you know? We very much try to incorporate a historical twist to it and a bit of South African flair. But the idea is that we can go pretty much in any direction, okay? So what Vince and I do is we sit down together, we make some topics, and then we go home and research them both independently. And then we come together and we chat about them. And honestly, this topic had a few hiccups.
Yeah, this week was a little dicey, I would say.
It was a little dicey. I think that's kind of my fault. I mean, we sat together. I came up with what I thought was such a fantastic topic. I called it The Cardinal Sins of Ordinality.
It's a great title.
It's a great title. It obviously has a certain, as the French say, I don't know what. And you know, those that are economically inclined would have heard of cardinal utility and ordinal utility. We're not going to, you know, perhaps go into that this episode, but I mean, I quickly messaged Vince and said, man, I'm struggling to research this one. It's all, you know, every paper and every YouTube video, you know, nothing is very interesting.
It's very dry.
Very theory based. Very dry. I mean, it's an interesting idea, you know, how to measure utility and things like that. But I mean, it was tough to research. So Vince came up with an excellent topic.
We had to pivot.
Do you mind sharing? Yeah, we had to pivot. Vince, share your topic and go into detail about how you presented it to me.
Okay. So one of the cooler topics in economics, maybe doesn't get as much light as, let's say, game theory, but one that I find really fascinating is the union between economics and statistics, known as econometrics. And I had wanted to do this as a topic in the future, and this was the perfect opportunity to pivot into it. So when Devon messaged me saying that cardinal sins of ordinality just had nothing going on with it, I brought it up, and I was inspired by that. I don't know if it was a show or a documentary. I think it was Katy Perry just discovering like science as a whole, and she had this great interview with Neil deGrasse Tyson where she asked the poignant and, to be honest, really, really like underestimated question of, is maths related to science?
Just one of the greatest questions of all time. Truly, it was memed a lot on the internet. I think we were in high school at the time.
And so today we'll be asking and potentially answering the question of, is maths related to economics?
There we go. That is our topic sentence for today. And it was definitely easier to research this topic, I thought, but I also have taken it into a bit of a different direction. So, all right, let's paint the picture of maths and economics. So, for those at home are probably thinking, you probably maybe have two minds about this. Some of you are probably thinking, I mean, economics, isn't that just the study of, you know, like people? And some of you are thinking, I mean, you're talking about market dynamics. Of course, this has something to do with maths. Like, how do they figure out all the mathsy things behind it, you know? So, in essence, both of these people are kind of right. Economics essentially is this mix between psychology and mathematics to a certain extent, and describing how markets function in a very, you know, human world. And that poses a very interesting problem, you know? Are we even supposed to lump maths into that? Is it something that can even be quantified? if it is quantified, can it be quantified in an accurate way? So this was a debate that honestly raged throughout the 1800s and 1900s when economics was developing.
A history.
And the history. I'm not going to go into the history. I didn't find any nice anecdotes, but it was heavily debated. And as you could probably think, mathematics didn't actually come into economics, or it wasn't widely accepted in economics until kind of the late 1900s. So very much from the 1800s when economics it was developing, and even the early 1900s, economics was only, or rather mathematics was only a part of 25% of research papers. And today you'll very much struggle to find a research paper that doesn't use basic arithmetic, or not arithmetic, calculus rather, in its findings. There's different types of research as well, and the different types of research lend themselves to mathematics. There's inductive research, and then there's deductive research. But we're not really going to go into that. But it has been debated. In fact, most of these early economists took a very philosophical approach to it and said, maths can never understand human beings quite as well as we can, but they kind of struggled to come up with theories that could understand market dynamics. So maths. Most people would probably agree right now that maths is needed in economics, but the degree is quite debated even still today. But for sure, maths is used a lot more, and some say too much. All right, that's all in terms. That's the past right now. Okay. I just have one quote. I told last episode Vincent always comes.
I'm very excited.
I brought a quote, but this isn't a very flashy quote. This is from a book called The Consulates by Edward O. Wilson. And here's a few little snippets and quotes in here that I found actually quite insightful. One of his best quotes here reads, "All analysts understand that the broad pattern of economic process originate in some fashion or other from vast numbers of decisions made by human beings, whether as individuals or as members of firms and government agencies. The most sophisticated models of economic theory attempt to translate such microeconomic behavior into the larger aggregate measures and patterns broadly defined as an economy." So what essentially that quote is saying is that lots of micro decisions, microeconomics, where you've understood patterns of behaviors on an individual level, lend themselves to macroeconomics. These patterns broadly describe what human beings do on the aggregate. There's some phrases that economists use all the time: on the margin, on the aggregate.
Yes.
Doesn't really matter, but that's essentially what maths really helps us with, is on aggregate, on a macroeconomic level, how are markets functioning to different stimuli, different price changes, how is supply and demand changing as price changes, as externalities occur. So this begs the question, and this is the direction I want to take it to. We've had the 1800s, the 1900s, and even, the 21st century, and we've had a lot of shocks and externalities and a lot of history. You'd expect economics to be really good at predicting stuff nowadays, right? A lot of bubbles bursting, a lot of not going to say a lot of great depressions, but depressions and recessions throughout history. You'd expect us to have a hang of things by now.
At this point.
But at this point, right? There's a reason that economists exist, and you'd expect them to, economize things. You'd
do something.
Them to predict. You'd expect them to bloody well do something. But it feels like you never can. And that's kind of what I wanted to touch on. Why can't economists, having maths, able to run access to all this big data, access to government studies and well-funded research, how can we still not predict what humans do? How can't we predict this herd mentality of human beings? For those of you who don't know, when something falls outside of an economic model, it is called, or like a broadly accepted economic model, right? We won't get into that can of worms, but it's called an externality or a market failure. And a type of market failure is called a bubble. Now, everyone's heard of a bubble bursting. You'll hear it on the news. You'll hear it when the housing market crashes. You'll hear it when a Silicon Valley bank, kind of
Cryptocurrencies as well.
Currency deflates, exactly. The bubble bursts, very much like, it's like the glass. There's an episode of How I Met Your Mother where the glass kind of shatters in their heads when they figure out they're annoyed by their partners. But that's kind of what a bubble is. The glass is shattering in everyone's head because they're realizing something is overvalued. So the strict definition of an externality is when markets fail, the individual incentives for rational behavior do not lead to rational outcomes for a group as a whole. So if each individual makes rational choices, we've discussed rational choices before in the past, it's what all economists assume humans are. Some behavioral economics make some leeway there, but everyone acts rationally and in a reasonable amount of self-interest, right? Mm-hmm. But when people all do that collectively as a group, individuals, when they do that, a bad outcome happens for society. An example of that is bubbles bursting.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, and I've discussed this with Vince before as well. I mean, in my macroeconomics 3 class, I really love this idea. I like this idea that an economist's job is not to predict when stuff happens. It's to try and stop it from happening again, sure, but how do they stop it from happening again? This is discussed a lot in game theory, but it's essentially to change incentives so that that if everyone acts in their own self-interest, an externality is eventually going to happen, right? What you need to do is change those incentives so that when everyone acts in their own self-interest, a good outcome for society also happens. But I want to paint you an example of something like this. This is what I liken it to. All right. So we have our farmer, Fred. Okay? Farmer Fred is a great farmer. He makes $50 a month and he uses sustainable farming practices that don't harm the environment. However, Farmer Bob makes $60 a month by using practices that harm the environment. So already that is kind of an environmental externality, right? Yeah. Farmer Bob is acting in his own self-interest in even a more stricter sense than Farmer Fred is, and he's making money, right? So what does an economist do? I mean, what would an economist actually say to the government? There would usually be an economist behind this who's kind of trying to make a regulation to stop this. What an economist do, he would run some numbers, do some calculus, maths would 100% be involved. And he'd say, all right, we are going to impose a $15 fine for those polluting the lake, that just like Farmer Bob is. So, right? So if Farmer Bob now knows of this fine, he would realize that he would only be able to make $45 a month from polluting the nearest lake. So naturally, his incentives have changed. That externality becomes, essentially disappears because the government, an economist who has advised the government, has changed the incentives of polluting and using polluting practices.
Yes.
But where it falls apart, there's this term, there's a hole at the bottom of mathematics. There's a hole at the bottom of economics and humans in general. Okay? Because humans have to have oversight over humans. And whenever humans are involved, greed plays a role, laziness plays a very big role. So you could imagine that behind the scenes, there's a government supervisor named, I've called him Dylan in my example, who is very hardworking, okay? And he inspects factories, and factories have, factories that he's supervising have a zero tolerance, policy. However, then there's government official Robert, who becomes very lax. Maybe he's very stringent in the present, or like maybe in the past, about enforcing non-polluting farming practices. But unlike, government official Dylan, he becomes less stringent and he becomes lackadaisical, and eventually Farmer Bob will just realize there's no oversight here. He can go back to polluting. So I feel that encapsulates a lot of what happens. That kind of cycle. What did I call it? I called it an externality cycle.
Yes.
I don't care if it's accurate, but you can kind of realistically see that happening in real life. Corruption from politicians and things like that, government officials, government agencies. Just maybe there's even just too many companies and too many farms. It's impossible. That regulatory process often dies out. It happened in the global financial crisis when regulation rating agencies for assets and asset classes and mortgage bonds were essentially being bought off by big banks. These are government agencies that very much contributed to the global financial crisis. And this happens at companies where some of the workers will shirk responsibilities. In economics, we call people who don't do anything shirkers, because they don't work, they shirk their responsibilities. And very much, there's all these cases of whenever this happens, the incentives of the individual almost never match up with what will bring the best outcome for society.
Unfortunately.
And honestly, I'm not too sure what your opinion on this, Vince, is, but I feel like that's the root cause of why economists can't accurately predict the future. Is that, funnily, humans, they weasel their way out of everything. Laws in place, things like that. They'll lobby against it. They'll figure out some person to attack rather than the law itself, and they'll get around it. And eventually, there will be lack of oversight. The people you trust to oversight will do wrong. Your neighbor will do wrong first, but when you elect people to have that oversight, when you maybe even amongst companies you'll have a board, eventually it'll weasel its way in. So what is your take on that, Vince? We've chatted about it before, but maybe you just want to chat to our audience about it too.
Yeah, I think it's, with economics, there's a lot of assumptions and hypotheticals at the root of it. Like, there's statistics that economists base their findings off of, but there's always an asterisk next to it, where a lot of these theories come with the assumption that people are rational. And I really agree with you that, like, when you put in place a policy, there's no wording or incentive that you can really make that will have everybody follow it. Because I think it's going to be upsetting to some people, and those people will pay as much money as necessary to move around it, to shirk it, to weasel their way out of paying that tax or contributing in a specific sort of way. And it's that route kind of does make it super difficult. And I think when you were talking about, like, in the 1800s and, like, even earlier, when people were talking about how statistics or maths, does it have a place in economics? I think it's very interesting because economics is so based around these people and the decisions they make, whether they'll shirk or accept new policy. So sometimes it does feel like when you bring in statistics or mathematics, it almost doesn't really gel with what economics really is about, this kind of social science and how people make decisions in the face of certain resources lacking or certain policies being placed into effect. So sometimes it does feel like they don't go together.
Yeah, it's like, it's very philosophical. I mean, so much of what economists do is like trying to figure out, we talk about societal preferences. I mean, that is even a big topic of debate as well. Is if an entire society has a preference for some kind of governance, is it anyone's right to really change that? But and then there's so many kettles of fish, like
exactly. And if
what
you
kind of
can't,
democratic process is there supposed to be? You know, how
oh
do you
yes,
understand the democratic process that they want? Are these preferences? Is it some kind of Stockholm syndrome across different amounts of policymakers? Do they really want more of a progressive tax system, or do they want, you know, one where it's not quite as progressive? You know, it's tough, man. It's tough. It's philosophical and it's dirty stuff. And maths is, I feel maths is so clean. You know, it paints a clear picture, and then putting this clear picture next to such a messy mess that modern civilization is, or that all civilizations have been, it's tough. And I feel, you know, as an economist, it's like, damn, they're so right. We can't really predict much. You know,
yeah,
we can, maybe in isolated circumstances, we can say, oh yeah, when a forest burns down, the price of paper will go up because there's less paper. It's like, okay, great. You know, I mean, that's basic stuff. I hope we can predict that. But
but
when
like
there's
what the price of the
giant
paper will
recession,
be, or the quantity of
oh,
paper that is like going to be supplied, that part might get a little fuzzy.
oh man, it's rough. So that's kind of what I wanted to bring to the table, right? Is sure, maths does have a place in economics, but economics, you know, has flaws for sure, that maths can't patch. That psychology and behavioral economics itself can't patch. And I find that quite interesting. Um,
It's
so
super
yeah,
fascinating. Like it reminds me of this is not my area of expertise. I mean, even economics, I wouldn't say, but there's a kind of quantum state in physics where, like, if you're trying to measure, like, the speed of an electron around an atom, for example, you can measure the speed, but you don't know, like, where it is at any given point. But if you know where it
mm,
is, you don't know how fast it's going. It does feel like with economics, there's sometimes where you just can't pinpoint one thing if you know something else, or it's that uncertainty's built into it.
exactly. Exactly. So Vince, I'm curious to figure out where you took this topic sentence from. Vince and I chatted to each other before the podcast began, and he told me he's got this episode. So I'm keen. So where did you take it, my good friend?
So I kind of went a little bit meta with the topic. Econometrics and statistics in economics is like super fascinating, but I think can get to the point where it's very dry. So what I decided to kind of like shed light on is not only the fantastic stuff that econometrics has helped accomplish, topics like actual empirical evidence that education leads to a better quality of life overall, and how minimum wage can affect employment, as well as many other world changing topics that econometrics has helped bring to the limelight. I also wanted to chat about how econometrics can sometimes be not as straightforward as you might think. I think I, and perhaps others, sometimes have this conception of statistics as this ultimate objective truth in the world. And while that may be true, it does beg the question, how can economists disagree with each other if there's this objective fact number that is like in front of them on any experiment that they decide to
Yeah.
make?
So just before you go, I mean, so Vince and I, we had a module in third year. It was called quantitative economics, and it was
Yes,
kind of this precursor towards your honors courses, which is very much, you know, from bachelor's degree onwards, you know, and your honors, very much econometrics based.
very
You're
important.
getting a lot of data, you're doing your own research, you're pumping it into statistical software, and you're running regressions on it. You're teasing the data, you're trying to figure out where things are correlated and where causation exists instead. Maybe you'll touch on that a bit later. But we have a bit of background to it. But even that small project we did, and I think we did quite well in it,
Yes,
makes you realize, you know, how difficult that really is. These numbers, you know, as much as you think they're such an objective, haha, they can be interpreted in different ways. But you can also tease them, and you can really play with it, and sometimes that does cause distrust in it.
exactly. There's this great quote by Mark Twain that says, "Facts are stubborn, but statistics are pliable," which I think is really quite.
Bastard. He brought in a Mark Twain quote. Oh, shit.
But yeah, economists and, to be honest, experts in any profession will find different results out of the same statistics because not only is there such a process in what you base your findings off of, but then interpreting those same findings can be a whole variety or can bring forth a whole variety of conclusions. And to kind of put this in economics perspective, we can talk about like a decrease in the unemployment rate. Like economists can analyze and interpret the same decrease in unemployment rate and then bring about their own theoretical perspectives to come to different conclusions. For example, a Keynesian economist who, to just reiterate to our first-time listeners, is an economist who believes that government intervention is an important part of maintaining the economy, kind of to stop it from spiraling out of control. A Keynesian economist might view that decrease in the unemployment rate as a positive sign of economic recovery. They might see it as an indication that demand has increased as a result possibly from government spending or expansionary monetary policy, which has stimulated economic growth and is now creating jobs. And they would say that the government intervention is an important role. However, a classical economist, one that believes that self-market regulation should be kept to itself without any real government intervention, would maybe see a decrease in the unemployment rate with maybe a bit more of a cautionary perspective. They might kind of emphasize that it's important to let market forces and potentially even supply side factors determine employment rates instead, and that it might be a result of workers exiting the labor force, whether it be finding other jobs or other demographic factors. They might emphasize the fact that certain policies promoting labor flexibility and reducing structural barriers would be more ideal. And thirdly, a labor economist might focus on what kind of employment was gained in that decrease of the unemployment rate. They might look at the fact that what kind of jobs were the ones that were gotten by people, such as wage growth, labor force participation rates, and other sort of part-time or precarious employment might not be a good sign, even though the unemployment rate has decreased. So,
like maybe it's very, it's not like, high class work, perhaps, wages are, workers are getting exploited at a higher rate. I mean, hey, look, the number of unemployment is decreasing, but, maybe it's exploitative in some kind of manner, right?
yeah, or like over the summer, for example, like high school students or college students might get like a part-time job, which might see an increase in the employment rate, but that's not a permanent position in most cases. So there's a lot of nuances with certain economic questions, even if the statistics seem to draw an obvious conclusion. And again, while this may seem like fairly intuitive, I know myself, and likely a lot of people, when they see that there's been a decrease in the unemployment rate, I would automatically assume that that is unequivocally a good thing, you know?
Mm.
How would you feel if you saw that in a newspaper, for example?
I mean, like, what do you mean? You feel great when you see that. You think, oh my word, our government is finally... I think, finally the government is doing something positive, I mean, that's just my subconscious. Other people would think, aha, free market forces are going to town on unemployment. Good, our government needs to stuff up a lot more, like, like definitely I could see that a lot of people having varying perspectives, right?
Yeah. I think especially in South
also,
Africa as well.
some people are terrified of high employment because they say, "Oh my God, inflation in the next few years is going to be horrible."
Absolutely.
Like there's so many different nuanced takes economists have, and they're all like, "Oh, this is good." But always there's some guy that's like, it's not good if, and then they cite X, Y, and Z, and then you go, oh shit, he could be right.
No, there's definitely pluses and minuses to a lot of things, which, especially in economics, gives it that there's no true, like, good results without some bad things, and I feel like you also touched on that too. But to kind of illustrate this point a little bit further, I want to bring forth like a real life example in economics where the use of statistics and econometrics ended up being for the worst, and kind of encompasses a lot of the stuff that we've been chatting about, really, on why econometrics can sometimes be this dangerous but powerful tool that you can play with. So, in 2010, there was a study on debt and growth known as the Reinhart-Rogoff study by economists Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff. They published it in 2010, and this study gained quite a significant amount of attention with regards to policy debates surrounding public debt and economic growth. The study itself examined the relationship between a country's level of public debt and then its subsequent economic growth. This is right after the housing crisis. So at the time, the US's economy was experiencing a lot of public debt after bailing out a lot of these banks. The main finding of that study suggested that when a country's GDP, debt to GDP ratio exceeds about 90%, so the debt that they have is about 90% of their total earnings, more or less, economic growth drastically declines. It's roughly cut in half, more or less, according to this study. And this finding had such a profound effect and impact on the policy discussions leading after it, particularly in the context of what the government can do about it, whether they should be practicing fiscal austerity measures, which in essence is kind of reducing government expenditure on things like infrastructure and kind of social programs, as well as increasing tax rates. And following the 2008 financial crisis, this was one of the leading studies that enforced the idea that these fiscal austerity measures needed to be put into place. And by many policymakers, politicians, and pundits of sorts, they brought this study as an argument for fiscal austerity and debt reduction. People like the US Congressman Paul Ryan, the UK Chancellor George Osborne, and Olli Rehn, who was the leading economic official of the European Commission. So as you can see, this had a global impact on the world, and many countries thereafter decided to put these fiscal austerity measures into place. Does it sound like I'm kind of heading for a train wreck here? Okay.
Can you also Englishify austerity measures for me? I'm a bit lost in the source, to be honest.
No problem. So fiscal austerity measures are, to kind of break it down simply, it's like what the government can do to reduce debt. Like a company, a way that you can reduce debt would be to stop getting more debt. So you stop spending, and from a government's perspective, that would be stopping expenditure. So they wouldn't spend as much on infrastructure. They wouldn't spend as much on social programs, as well as increasing tax rates. So they draw more money in. With the combination of those two things, you can see how a government might not only not gain more debt, but decrease their current debt level.
Yeah. Okay. Got you.
But yeah, so several countries embarked on these austerity programs, and they placed together measures to reduce public spending and reduce their government deficits. Obviously, the kind of counterbalance to that, when the government isn't spending as much money, not only on infrastructure and social programs, which people rely on, they're also likely not taking on a new department, losing employment. People are likely being let go. Tax rates being increased might mean that some people don't either find ways of avoiding those tax increases, illegally or illegally, or aren't as incentivized to make more money. So not only does this kind of reduce government deficit, but it has a profound effect on not only employment, but the economy as a whole. So these were put into place, and nothing really changed too much. And in 2013, a graduate set of students from the University of Massachusetts, specifically Thomas Herndon, Michael Ash, and Robert Pollan, identified critical errors in the spreadsheet calculations used in that study. They analyzed that the results were significantly changed when you corrected the errors that were in the paper. And when they were corrected, it was found that that negative relationship between high debt and economic growth was a lot weaker than in the original study. So when properly calculated, the average GDP growth rate for countries carrying a public debt to GDP ratio of 90% is about 2.2%. Whereas in the original study, it was negative 0.1%.
Well, all right.
So, contrary to that study, average GDP growth with the GDP to public debt ratio being over 90% is not dramatically different to when the GDP to debt to GDP ratio was a lot lower.
What did the original authors say? Did they, like, is it just an example of, them being biased towards some kind of, outcome that they wanted? Did they just own up to it? Did they even say anything? Do you know?
So they looked at the study, these students from the University of Massachusetts, and then they began to inquire with the original people who wrote the study, Reinhardt and Rogoff. And fair play to them, they were fairly amicable in giving these students not only the spreadsheet calculations, but also kind of illustrating their line of thought. However, when they were kind of called up on it, they did make kind of like this very sorry apology about using various to kind of break down what was wrong with the study. The study itself kind of took a sample from many different countries, but they were very cherry-picked, and they excluded countries like New Zealand that would have altered the study not as much in the favor of the direction that they were trying to push it, so to speak. But when they were called out on it, they were somewhat amicable, but very tail between their legs in their apology thereafter. But they received substantial criticism, and this kind of reevaluated how economic policies should be impacted by these single studies, and it raised concerns about how a singular paper or flawed research could impact these policy decisions. And yeah, it was summed up quite nicely by Paul Krugman in 2013 when this came into light. He said, What the Reinhardt-Rogoff affair shows is the extent of which austerity has been sold on false pretenses. For 3 years, the turn to austerity has been presented not as a choice, but as a necessity. Economic research, austerity advocates insisted showed that terrible things happen once debt exceeds 90% of GDP. But economic research, in quotation marks, showed no such thing. A couple of economists made that assertion, while many others disagreed. Policymakers abandoned the unemployed and turned to austerity because they wanted to, not because they had to.
Ooh, that is a spicy statement, keepers.
That is a roast and a half. And to be fair, because of these two, who debatably on how intentionally they wanted to, like whether this was just negligence or they were actually trying to push a certain narrative. The end of the day is, because of it, people lost their jobs, people were unemployed, and people weren't doing great, in essence. And it just kind of like spoke to me about like, okay, statistics are this powerful tool, but if you're like not thorough with them, especially on such a scale where policies are made because of them, it can be very dangerous.
Yeah. And even from, I mean, most people are like, how were they wrong? Just having less debt, that's a good thing for a country. Like, what do you mean?
Yes.
Like they're less in debt. Like, it sounds like a terrific thing. But obviously there's that factor of, to decrease debt, you have to decrease spending. Okay, and governments do play a big role in employment. They are the largest employers in pretty much any country, right? They're bigger than Amazon. They're bigger than Amazon in the US. Like the
Absolutely.
US government employs more people. There's that aspect, but also like you can leverage funds from debt and from like a simple loan to get more money, and to put it to greater use and give you more income in the future. If you're smart about it, right? That's kind of why companies take out loans, so they can invest it, whether it be in capital or financial assets, and get more, for example. So, I mean, debt is not a bad thing in a strict sense. It is simply a thing. And much of every economic instrument, it is very dependent on, firstly, your situation, environment, and the preferences of that society. But also, it's dependent on your level of risk that you want to take. Some societies will like that, and it's dependent on how you use it, what your game plan is once you take on risk. So, I mean, there's merit to both arguments, 100%. But that's why you can't make such rapid generalizations and assertions, even if you think it's less debt. How can it be bad? Oh, it can.
Yeah.
It can.
It's a real interesting topic. And I think, like, the takeaway that I got from the story is not that, like, the GDP or debt to GDP should be, like, really high, or that it's okay that it's really high. But I think with policies and stuff, you are, especially in light of, like, something as the housing crisis in 2008, the decisions you make are like the best out of a bad scenario. There's no real perfect way to exit and return things to normal. But you want those decisions to be based on accurate and reliable facts.
Yeah. Yep. Preferences of society won't change that easily unless it's accurate and factually based, right? So you can only imagine how much of a reputational hit something like that would have been to like some kind of department within some governments around the world. That's a tricky one, man. It's a bit somber as well.
Yeah, I hopefully it's not a trend that I just bring somber topics, but I think it's really fascinating. Like statistics, I think especially in the current climate we're in, where a lot of new technology is being brought to like the forefront and has this amazing like impact not only on just like writing with ChatGPT, but also like quantum computing, hopefully in the near future. Like there's a lot of cool stuff that could be happening in the world of economics, and I'm really excited for it.
Have you seen? You've watched I Love Robots on Netflix, right?
Yes.
it's basically a little mini skit series on Netflix and one of these skit series there's
Love
this
Death Robots, I think.
Yes, I love Death Robots. There we go. Where this yogurt becomes sentient, becomes extremely smart and sentient. Okay, and he hands, the U.S. is crumbling, and this yogurt hands the president a piece of paper that says, "Okay, this piece of paper, if you follow it to the letter, you can eliminate all debt in the United States and economically flourish." Right, and it would work. But hands it to the president. He says, "Lekker, you get me out of this this bad situation." Then it kind of skips 2 years in the future, and then the White House is kind of like burning down, and the president doesn't know what to do because he didn't follow the yogurt's commands. Could you imagine if ChatGPT does something similar?
Yeah,
tries to solve economics, and then humans still found a way to stuff it up.
I mean, you know what? I wouldn't be surprised.
Would be surprised. So Vince, is maths related to economics?
I think, you know what? This is actually a difficult question to answer, even in light of what we spoke about. It's related to it. We might be kind of forcing it together a little bit, but I don't know if maths is inherently joined with economics at the root of all things, at the decision-making root. But I think so.
I think maths. I think it as well. I think really maths and the mechanics of the universe, they're kind of related to everything. Not surprised that they're related, at least in some way, to economics, even if you can argue about whether it's more or less.
Yeah,
right?
I agree. But yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. Make sure to like and subscribe and follow, and give this podcast a recommendation to your friend. Word of mouth is fantastic for growth. Yeah.
Economic growth.
Hopefully you've enjoyed, and we'll see you next time.